Hi, everyone. Welcome to Act Now. I'm Julianna Forlano. I've got a great show lined up for you today. Here we are watching the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow wind down. Climate chaos and cascading ecological disasters are becoming more and more of concern as a national security issue. But will the concern of the most militarily armed nation on earth lead to mitigation of the climate crisis, or just a heightened call to further armaments, further defense, and more war? Joining us, I have a great guest joining us today for our interview portion of the show, which is going to take up the whole show, which I'm very excited about. Author and scholar Anatol Lieven is joining us for our interview segment. Don't forget to share, like, comment on this show. Stay tuned for our interview. The COP26 meeting continues in Glasgow, and as new information suggests we are closer to potential runaway climate change and the ensuing chaos than our political and societal structures will be able to handle. Climate chaos and cascading ecological disasters are viewed as a major risk by the U.S. national security apparatus. Do we have a plan? Does that plan account for the fact that the military-industrial complex profits off contributing to the climate destruction? Are we, as a nation, aiming to protect ourselves by mitigating the destruction, or will we choose to wage ever more war that creates climate catastrophe in the first place, just to protect our national interest as the world burns? Joining me to discuss all this and more, author and scholar Anatol Lieven. He is a senior fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the author of Climate Change and the Nation State. The Quincy Institute is an organization that works to build a world where peace is the norm and war is the exception. Anatol, thank you so much for joining me on the program tonight.
Hello.
Well, let's jump right in. Does the national security apparatus in the U.S. concern itself mainly with the potential for armed conflict when it comes to climate change and the ensuing chaos that we face? Or are they interested in combating climate change itself in the name of a secure nation?
They're interested to a degree, but they are still, overwhelmingly configured for war. They would say defense, and to meet traditional security threats. Now, unlike, it must be said, the vast majority of the Republican Party, the Pentagon does at least recognize that anthropogenic climate change is happening, and that it is a threat, and it threatens American national interests. And the Pentagon has written of climate change as a threat multiplier in other countries. In other words, something that will make a range of other dangers and threats worse. But if you look at what they talk about most, and above all, of course, what they spend their money on, climate change is actually well down the scale compared to the traditional security threats as they would portray it from China and Russia.
So what specifically are the security aspects that the government is most concerned about? In your book, you discuss the large-scale displacement of people and climate refugees.
Well, what they ought to be concerned about is the warnings we've had out of COP26 this week that on present trajectories, after COP, after what has not been done at COP, we are still on course for between 2.4 and 2.7 degrees of warming.
That is not good.
What
is that going to look like?
Well, the next century has been described as the century from hell. But what one has to be aware of course, as you mentioned, is the risk that it won't obviously stop at that. That 2.4, 2.7 will lead to runaway climate change. I just heard today latest estimates that the release of methane from the Arctic permafrost could raise temperatures, could raise temperatures by 1.2 degrees over a very few years. Now, at that point, you're heading for societal collapse all over the world. Now, that's not quantifiable, but it's non-negligible. So, that is an existential threat to the United States as a country. And if our national security establishment isn't worried about that, what are they worried about? But short of that, has talked about, which is the threat of state collapse in many parts of the world as climate change feeds into existing problems of drought, water shortages, and of course state weakness, ethno-religious conflict, all the things that went into the building the civil war in Syria, for example.
There are voices out there in the international relations sphere, Steven Pinker, Joshua Goldstein, for example, that suggest the connection between global climate change and armed conflict is actually dubious, I think was the word that Goldstein used. He said that there's a national security significance of climate change, but it's not as a primary reason for increased conflict. The quote is, people will starve, people will drown, but not necessarily die in conflict. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, it won't necessarily lead to war between states, but then actually, if you look at recent decades, there have been very few wars between states. Most of the wars have been internal civil wars, with then outside actors becoming involved. And that is something the Pentagon itself has warned against. The Syrian civil war scenario, for example, where you have a meltdown of the state, you have revolt then leading to ethno-religious conflict, with climate change contributing to all this because it increases poverty, it increases displacement of people from the countryside. It generally, it just it lights a fire under existing problems until they boil over. And we've got, heaven knows, enough civil wars raging in the world already, without climate change making them much, much worse.
You talked about the inflamed tensions that climate change would contribute to when it comes to the U.S.'s interaction with China, with Russia. Can you talk a little bit about that? Oh, I think you're frozen a tiny bit. Are you able to hear me? There you go.
No, you cut out for several minutes, I'm afraid.
Well, it's amazing that we can do this at all across the ocean. I'm thrilled that we could do this at all. My question was about what are the implications of climate change to our relationships and the tensions, quite frankly, we have between Russia and China and the United States.
Well, with Russia, I mean, the problem is getting Russia to act at all. Now, the Putin government has now recognized that climate change is happening, which for a long time they didn't. So has Russian educated society in general. But of course, Russia is a country which is extremely dependent on the export of oil and gas, and also lacks the technological capacity to do a great deal in this regard. There, the task is really for the Biden administration to live up to what it has said is its strategy, which is to, of course, maintain a position of hostility or resistance to Russia on a range of issues while cooperating where we have mutual interests, which we do on climate change. With China, it's this too, but it's also about competing with China to develop the necessary technology and to not control, but to compete for renewable energy markets in future. But it's also, above all, about avoiding, obviously, military conflict, but also exaggerated military rivalry with China, which is drawing so many resources away from the struggle against climate change.
I heard that China is recently putting in, and they can do this because they have authoritarianism that they can rely on. They're putting in a mandate that all cars, or I think, what is it, 50% of cars be, electric vehicles by not very far from right now, 2025, is it? 2030, something very, very close. Do you think that that's a reachable goal?
By the way, the British government has done the same. 2030, all new vehicles should be electric by 2030. So, democracies can do that as well. Britain can do that because there is a basic consensus here. Obviously, there are great disagreements between Labour and the Conservatives about how to do it. But unlike in America, the entire political spectrum agrees that climate change is happening and that it is a problem and that something must be done about it. So then you can, in a democracy, you can achieve things if you have a national consensus of that kind. But you're quite right. I mean, it's certainly easier in China. Well, I think they can do it because, yeah, they're an authoritarian state. But of course, there is one thing to keep in mind, which is that the electricity from electric cars has to be generated somewhere. If the Chinese generate the electricity for their electric cars with coal, then we are no further forward when it comes to combating climate change.
Yes, that is a problem. I know you spoke at a conservative climate group at the COP26, and getting back to a point that you just made, progressives, the Labour Party in the UK versus the Conservatives in the UK, what is the difference between tactics? How would Conservatives want to approach dealing with climate change? I don't even know. I mean, in the United States, they just want to ignore it.
Most of them. There are some, conservative Republican climate change activists here, so it's not everybody, but yeah, I mean, the great majority. I mean, the difference, of course, is that the Conservatives obviously prefer, in principle, whenever possible, free market solutions, and Labour and the Greens are more given to much more state intervention. But then again, there is a tradition in Britain to which I think the Johnson government is returning to a considerable, which is about state leadership. They wouldn't talk about state control, but state leadership of the economy in the fight against climate change. And had a former Conservative Environment Minister today saying that, as soon as you appoint a Conservative MP as Environment Minister or somebody who has to deal with the environment, they suddenly discover that, yeah, state intervention is essential. The difference with America is that they come from a more statist tradition. We heard references today to, how in the past Conservative leaders in time of war absolutely accepted the need for state control of the economy, but also that if you move in conservative circles in Britain, except for some absolute dinosaurs, you don't get this absolute immediate instinctive rejection of climate change and climate change action that you do, unfortunately, in so many circles in the United States.
What exactly is the national security apparatus in the United States doing at this point? I mean, they have recognized that it's a threat. What action are they taking?
Not a lot. I mean, there have been limited promises to move towards, electric vehicles in particular in future, but there are huge obstacles to that. Does that fall under the purview
of national security, or are they just trying to work in conjunction with other, arms of the government?
They're trying to work in conjunction with other arms of the government. I mean, their language has changed radically, of course, as one would expect since Biden came in. Though, to be fair, under the Trump administration, the Pentagon did go on talking about climate change, just not nearly so much. Of course, there is one branch of the US Armed Forces which has been, absolutely engaged, not in climate change as such, but in flood control, water management, irrigation, since its very beginnings, and that's the US Army Corps of Engineers. I mean, my sense is that at some point in the future, they are going to become the most important branch of the US Armed Forces. And it's a good thing that, there is this important branch in which many famous American generals have spent part of their career. Now they are really plugged into this issue. But unfortunately, at present, they are not up there alongside the Air Force or the Marine Corps. They ought to be.
How on earth are we going to mitigate the fact that the military-industrial complex is such a force in our government? They profit mightily off wars that then contribute to more ecological destruction, more climate change. tons of emissions are happening. Our armed forces. I don't know the exact numbers. I'm imagining maybe you do. The percentage of emissions from the United States that come from our armed forces and our conflicts abroad. How are we going to? I don't see how we could address the profit motive that it has a stranglehold on the United States government and is really what is keeping the government from acting. I don't think it's popular opinion. I think popular opinion has been co-opted by, arms front groups like the NRA and different things like that. How are we going? I don't see the military industrial complex starting, instead of making, F-16 bombers, making plowshares.
Well, maybe extremely expensive plowshares with huge amounts of technology in them. Because, I think the thing about the military-industrial complex is that it's not actually necessarily so interested in wars, not the kind of wars that have been fought in Afghanistan, because, of course, contractors make huge amounts of money from that. But, what the classical military-industrial complex is really interested in is huge, highly sophisticated, enormously expensive weapons systems, which on the whole are not used or useful in guerrilla wars. So they want confrontation with China. They don't necessarily want war with China. They'd rather just make more and more and more and more and more weapons and then not have to use them. But remember, the grip of the military-industrial complex on Congress, for example, it's not just about bribing senators or congressmen or giving them jobs or whatever. It's also because it does provide a huge number of jobs in these people's constituencies. And in many ways, since, the past 50 years almost now, Republicans have not allowed America to have a state-led industrial development plan to maintain high-tech industries in America. And yet at the same time, everybody knows America's got to do something in this regard. So the military-industrial complex has functioned as America's technological industrial plan that dare not speak its name. Of course, in a horribly wasteful, the most wasteful, corrupt possible way. But it does create jobs, and of course it does create new technologies of a kind. So I think the only way forward...
Please go, continue.
So I think the only way forward, as indeed the Biden administration has argued and tried to emphasize, is turning renewable energy and a range of other things as well, clean nuclear energy, carbon capture if we can get there, new battery technology, to turn that into the same kind of driver of technological growth and jobs that the function that is now being fulfilled, unfortunately, by the military-industrial complex. That, for me, is perhaps the only way forward.
Can't Raytheon just start making the stuff that we need to fight climate change or to mitigate it in the first place? Can't they retrofit what they're doing? I don't care if it's the same company. I don't think they're gonna. I just want to be able to live and have my children have clean, not have to live through state collapse, etc.
Look, I entirely agree, and I'd say the same about the energy companies. If they can be persuaded to put their money into renewable energy, okay. I'm fairly skeptical about that, I must say. These are enormous beer moths which find it very hard to change course, and which have, of course, just so much capital sunk in existing technologies and existing modes. So, you have to build up new industries. But then, that's what the industrial revolutions of the past were all about, right? Rockefeller did not exist in 1840, nor did DuPont, nor did Andrew Carnegie. American steel industry did not exist in 1810. In 1750, there were no steam engines.
I'm not sure it went well. Given where we are today, I'm not sure that ended well.
Well, too early to say. We'll, without that, we might, be living in the circumstances of Sudan or somewhere today. Maybe. Well, what I'd say is, look, we can only fix this through technology, right? technological solution. I mean, short of mass human die-off, technology has to be the answer. But, technologies don't just happen. Especially technologies which are not inherently more profitable than the ones that already exist. I mean, unfortunately, fossil fuels are very good at what they were developed for, which is creating energy. They're very efficient at doing that, and coal is the cheapest of all because there's enormous amounts of the stuff lying around. Of course, they have a little side effect, which is that they're destroying the climate in the process. Yes. But to move from them to renewable energy requires state leadership, and state inputs, not just incentives, but the kind of enormous sums for research and development that we're now putting into research and development of weapons systems. And by the way, I mean, even if the Biden plan goes through, America will still be spending more than 3 times as much on researching weapons as on researching technology against climate change.
It's really interesting. It's kind of blowing my mind here because we're talking about what's going to help is state intervention. We're also talking about the fact that runaway climate change may be closer to our doorsteps than we thought, and that would dissolve states. What's the word that you use? State. I don't know, destruction of the states. They're not able to keep up.
Implosion really from within.
Yes.
Because of starving populations, mass displacement of people, and just, every social tension being increased by desperation.
Don't we see that happening already, separate from climate change, just by the pandemic, just by increasing inequality, but income inequality, racial tensions, different things that are happening in the U.S. as it stands already? Is national security concerned that we're already on the march to state collapse?
Well, yes, but other countries are much further in that direction, unfortunately. Because
that's not good news, since we all share the one Earth, but I guess it is.
No, it's not good news at all. But I mean, I think the lesson also is that you can't isolate the social and political and economic effects of climate change from whether it's in America or in India or in Mexico, or Nigeria, from all the other things that are going on. And states which are more coherent, with greater social solidarity, with less inequality, are in a much better position to resist the effects, because of course the point is, whatever we do now, things are going to get worse. We can't stop that because of all the carbon we've pumped into the atmosphere already. The challenge is to stop bad becoming cataclysmic. I mean, that we can still, pray God, achieve.
Oh, well, I hope so. I really hope so. Thank you for coming on the program today, and thank you for the work that you do and for coming and answering these questions. I hope you'll join us again. This is such an important conversation, and I'm very glad that Joe Cirincione from the Quincy Institute made the electronic introduction so that you would come on the program today. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
We've been speaking Bye-bye. We've been speaking to Anatol Lieven. He is a senior fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the author of Climate Change and the Nation State. If you like this conversation and you would like some more, read that book. It'll make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I had so many more questions, but we can't keep him forever. Thanks for watching ACT TV. I'm Julianna Forlano. I know this was a little short episode for today, but we are off in DC doing a couple of things which we will bring you live in the weeks to come. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.